month, which we do in the olden days was done through Eidim, through witnesses, to count each month. That's known as Kiddush HaChodesh. That was the first mitzvah given to Bnei Yisrael as a people. There were only, we'll come back to that. And then after that mitzvah, we then go immediately on to the Korban Pesach. Dabru al kol hadat Yisrael, speak to the assembly of Israel. Le'mor be'asor lachodesh on the hazeh, yiku lahem ish ser lebeit avot ser lebayit. On the 10th of the month, take for themselves a ser. A ser actually is a word which means both potentially a lamb or a goat. It could mean either. And it says ser lebeit avot. This is quite interesting. A ser for your grandfather's house. Oh, I've got an echo coming back. I think maybe if someone's, hopefully it'll be okay now. Okay, it's a ser lebeit avot. It's a ser for your grandfather's house. Ser lebayit, a ser for your house. So what does that mean? It's a strange expression. Firstly, why does it say a ser for your grandfather's house, a ser for your house? A lamb for this, a lamb, if it's a lamb for your grandfather or the Beit Avot, why does it have to repeat and say it's a lamb for your house? And Rashi explains that firstly, you have to have a ser for your wider family, including grandparents. We've got sort of my grandparents, so to speak, with us, if we were to have our Korban Pesach together. But if, say, the lamb you had was not enough, was effectively, you had a very big, wider family, then not everyone potentially would be able to eat a kazayik, which was the minimum amount of olive size from that ser. Therefore, the Torah goes on to say, ser lebayit. It has to at least be enough so that every person in the smaller family will eat from that at least a kazayik. So that's the expression why it says ser lebeit avot, ser lebayit. On the other hand, if you look in the next verse, it says im yimat habayit. If the house was very small, miyot miser, basically too small to eat a whole ser by itself, to eat a whole lamb, there's not enough people. You would have to get together with your neighbors basically to eat it. According to the numbers of people, again, some repeating words here, but the problem here is, why was there a problem if one person, if there was too much food there? Because there's a concept with Korban generally, you can't leave anything over. You've got to eat everything or offer everything up. So if it was too much for one person or one group, you should get together with your neighbors so that, yes, everybody has to have a minimum of kazayit, but you've also got to make sure there's no food is left over for the next day. It also interestingly says here, why does it sort of say, according to each person, lafi ochlo, what he can eat? Because that also teaches us something else, that if there were certain people in your group who were very elderly, who were ill, who actually can't eat, you've got to take that into account when you do your calculation as to how much food and how many people you get together to eat, so to speak. So this is teaching us the practicalities of the Korban Pesach. Ser tamim zachar, it has to be a pure ser, often without blemish, like with other Korban. It can't have any wound, so to speak, on it. Has to be male. Ben Shana has to be within the first year. Ben Shana always means within the first year. Any Korban had to be at least 8 days old. If it's a Ben Shana, what it means has to be at least 8 days old, but in this case, less than a year. Why it has to be at least 8 days old? Because it's almost like with the Brit Milah. You have to, even an animal has to go through one Shabbat, so to speak, to recognize the creation of the world, so to speak. It's gone through that period. So from 8 days old, an animal potentially could be offered up. And in this case, had to be within its first year. And it should be from either lambs or sheep, effectively, lambs, or from goats. You could take either. Okay, so that's what you have to do. And then you would have to guard it until the 14th. So they had to guard it for 4 days. And that was in line with generally the rules with korbanot is you have to look after them 4 days before you end up offering them up, because you want to check over that period of time that there's no wounds happen to them, etc. That's what they had to do until the 14th. And then then they were checked it, and it's interesting, the expression here, 3 different words here: kahal, the community; adat, the assembly; Yisrael, bein habayim, in the afternoon. And this is the first, I'm going to focus here on the mitzvot to do with the Korban Pesach. This is the first mitzvah we've got, shechting, offering up the Korban, so to speak. And if you go down, the next sources, from source 2 onwards, are from a book called the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch was a Rishon. It's actually unknown who he was, but he's accepted by everyone as being an authorized, very reputable source. And he was one of the first people who enumerated all of the mitzvot in the Torah. Because we know that there are 613 mitzvot in the Torah, but it doesn't tell us, as you go through the Torah, what the 613 are. So we need various people to come along and tell us what are the 613. The Rambam, Maimonides, he enumerates in his book, the Sefer HaMitzvot, what the 613 are. And the Sefer HaChinuch also enumerates the 613 in his Sefer. I remember when I was in yeshiva, in Gush, I used to learn every week with Rabbi Rosler. He wasn't Rabbi Rosler at the time, but we learned every week Sefer HaChinuch. And it was really a great introduction to a really good book. And it's available in English as well. And what it does, he goes through every single mitzvah and explains the rationale for every mitzvah, except, of course, there's 1 or 2, like famously Para Aduma, the red heifer, where there isn't a reason for it. But for every other mitzvah, he gives a reason for that mitzvah. So if you're ever looking to source material and find something interesting to say, he will go through and explain the rationale and the reason. And he wrote it to his son. It's like a sort of guidebook to his son to explain it, which is also very interesting, a nice way of putting it. So I'm going to refer to him. So in source 2, he says the first of these mitzvah shechitat haPesach. The first mitzvah is to actually shech the Korban Pesach. As he states, lishchot b'yom haba, to shech it on the 14th day of Nisan, bein habayim, in the afternoon, etc. And that's the reference from what we just said in Posuk Vav. So come back to the actual Torah reading in source 1 in Zion. We go on to say, and this is, of course, we know, v'lachhu min hadam, they took from the blood, v'nachnu al shtei mezuzot v'ala mashkof, and they put the blood on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel, ala batim, on the houses, asher yochlu oto behem, where they will sort of eat, where they will eat it, so to speak. The achlu et habasar b'layl hazeh, and then they ate the meat that night. Tzli'esh, roasted in fire. And this is the second mitzvah of eating. There's a separate mitzvah of shechting the Korban Pesach and eating the Korban Pesach. So the eating the Korban Pesach is source number 3. Mitzvah achilat basar Pesach, the mitzvah of eating the best Pesach. With most korbanot, they're not actually 2 separate mitzvahs of shechting and eating, even when you do eat it. So it's quite interesting. With the Korban Pesach, they are 2 separate mitzvahs: the mitzvah of shechting it and the mitzvah of eating it. And it says here, le'achol basar Pesach, to eat the meat of the Pesach, v'leil chamisha asar, on the night of the 15th, etc., etc. And that's the second mitzvah. And then he goes on to say in Posuk Het, has to be roasted in fire. And we know, of course, we're very particular on Seder night not to have food which is roasted. A link to this, umatzot, and we had and it was eaten with matzot. And then it says al marorim yochluhu, they should eat it with maror. And again, if you look darshaning the words, you've got to be very precise in the language here. It says you have the if you look at the notes, almost you can say you have the Korban Pesach roasted and the matzot, and then there's almost a stop. And that teaches you that from the Torah, the mitzvah of Korban Pesach exists, and the mitzvah of having matzah on Seder night exists. But then it says, and with the maror you should eat it. So the maror was only a mitzvah from the Torah if you ate it with the Korban Pesach. So when we have the maror today, it's not a mitzvah from the Torah, it's a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, it's a rabbinical mitzvah. So that's just a learn out of that. And then the next pasuk text says, and he's now talking about some of the negative things, the negative mitzvahs connected to the Korban Pesach. Al tokli mimenu na, don't eat it when it's raw. Uvasham vushal b'mayim, or let's say more uncooked. It is and also don't eat it when it's sort of boiled in water. Ki im sli eish, rather it's got to be roasted in fire. Rosha ala kuav al kirbo, its head alongside its legs with its innards. And this thing about this mitzvah of not eating it when it's uncooked is or eating it when it's been boiled is the number 4. The third mitzvah to do with the Korban Pesach. It says in my source sheet, Pesach, don't eat it uncooked or raw. It's got to be eaten. It's got to be eaten roasted, so to speak. Okay, and then we talk about veloto tirim menu and boka. Don't leave it over until the next day, which could again be a mitzvah. The Sefer Hinich doesn't list it out, but the Rambam does. And if anything you leave over till the next day, you have to burn it in the fire. Okay, so that's the introduction. This is the first time we come across the Korban Pesach. And then I've got a gap of various Pesukim, but just to give you the background, from Pasuk 12, so to speak, you'd bet up until 42, which is the gap in which I haven't printed on the source sheet, really talk about other things which we know about at the time. Things like God's promise to carry out the plague, the 10th plague, the Pesach festival, Moshe then instructing Bnei Yisrael in the Pesach offering, but there were actually no mitzvot in that little section. Then the 10th plague itself, Makkah B'Chovot, the death of the firstborn, then the start of the Exodus, the summary of the exile period, all that is covered. And then we come back to the Korban Pesach again towards the end of the chapter. So you got sort of mitzvot at the beginning of the chapter to do with the Korban Pesach, and mitzvot at the end of the chapter. And here, carrying on reading from Mem Gimel, Pasuk 43, those who are following in the Chumash says, Vayomer Adonai Moshe v'al Haron, Zot hu kata Pesach. This is the statute of the Pesach, which is actually itself is an interesting phrase, why it's called a hook at this point. It's a bit like the Para Aduma, which is known as a chok without a reason, but that's a subject for another shir. It says, Kol ben neicha lo yochal bo. Anybody who is a ben neicha can't eat it. So what does a ben neicha mean? If you go to number 5, source 5, the Sefer Hinich explains, he says, Shlo nachal min ha-pesach Yisrael meshumad. You can't give the Pesach to a Yisrael meshumad. Then explain, Shlo nachal min ha-pesach Yisrael muma la'avodah zarah. Somebody who's basically gone over and is serving avodah zarah. He's a non-believer, an apostate, we would say, I think, today. That this was a sort of, we'll see later, the Korban Pesach was really the ultimate sort of faith type action, something you think, and it would be contradictory to give it to somebody who's really got no belief, and so to speak, is now serving idols. So that's another mitzvah linked to the Korban Pesach. We carry on, Pasuk Mem Daled. Okay, you have to be circumcised, etc. Then Posuk Mem Hey Toshav v'Sachir lo yachal bo. This is another mitzvah. A Toshav and a Sachir can't eat it. So if you look to page 2 of my source sheet, it explains who is a Toshav. It says Lo nachem min ha-pesach leger v'Toshav. Don't give it to a ger and a toshav, and then he explains what does this mean. Shlo lachem b'basar pesach leger u'letoshav, shneimar toshav v'sacha lo yachal bo. V'hatoshav hu adam min ha'amot. It's somebody from amongst the nations, a non-Jewish person. Shekibal alav shelo la'avod avodah zarah. Accepted upon himself not to serve avodah zarah, v'ochel nevelot, or eat non-shechted meat. Carcass meat, so to speak, meat which hasn't been shechted. And this means basically he's accepted upon himself the 7 Noahide laws. So you might have thought that a non-Jew who's accepted 7 Noahide laws is should be entitled to have the Korban Pesach. No, this was specifically a Jewish event. But Sachir, and who's that? Who ger shemal? This is a sort of a convert who's basically he's circumcised, but lot taba, but he hasn't gone in the mikveh. So a part converted person. You've got to be fully Jewish to be able to have Korban. Okay, so that gives the mitzvah to them. And then we go on to say in Pesach Memvav, but by the you should eat it in one house. You can't take the meat outside of the house, and that's another mitzvah. You've got to have it in your group, so to speak. You can't take it outside from your group. And you also can't break any bones of it. And then we goes on to, and then there's one or two other things, other mitzvot, covered off as well about if you're uncircumcised, you can't eat it, etc. What I want to focus on now, so we've seen here, there are lots and lots of mitzvot to do with the Korban Pesach. In fact, the Rambam lists 16, including Pesach Sheni, where if you were impure, you had to bring the Korban Pesach on the next month, but certainly 11 to do with the Korban Pesach itself. The Sefer Chinuch, which we've quoted, has 8 mitzvot linked to it, of which I think I've got 7 here on the sheet. So what is the reason for so many mitzvot? And there's a beautiful piece in the Sefer Chinuch in source 8, which I want to look at, which really gives us the rationale why we've got so many mitzvot linked to the Sefer, to the Korban Pesach. And this is in source 8. It says, talking about the mitzvah not to break a bone from the Pesach, which again is all to do with being sort of royalty, that we don't start scrape away the last bits of meat from a Korban Pesach. We were supposed to enjoy it, so to speak, and that you'll be careful not breaking bones and things. And it gives the Mashashe HaMitzvah. So when the Sefer Chinuch goes through the mitzvah, he always talks about what's the root of the mitzvah, what's the reason, the time for the mitzvah. And he explains firstly, and I've sort of highlighted the bits in bold, those who've got the sheet, Liskor Nisei Mitzrayim, to remember the miracles of Egypt, Kamosha Katavnu Ba'achevot, as we've written in the other mitzvot above. So he's not going to repeat them, but in all the other mitzvot, he says, what's the main reason we're doing these things? In order for us to remember the miracles, basically, that God did to us in Egypt. This is all one big memory. Okay, so missing down to the bold bit here, he says, V'al takshov b'ni. So this is the beautiful words he uses. Don't pounce on my words, my son. He's writing to his own son here. Don't pounce on my words. Don't think, my son, to pounce on my words, so to speak. V'loman, to say. Why did God command us to do all these things to remind us for this one miracle? Wouldn't have been enough for just have one memory to remember, so to speak, in our thoughts, and we won't forget, and our sort of the future sort of our children won't forget it, so to speak. We don't need sort of 11 mitzvot connected to it. You can just have one mitzvah, or or 2 mitzvot. Why do we have to have so many mitzvot linked to the one action? And remember, this is really pretty much the first mitzvah the Bnei Yisrael got. I mean, yes, they got about the Kiddush HaChodesh of the new moon, but after that, this starts us off in our journey of mitzvot. So why are we getting so many at one go? And then Sefer Chinuch goes on to explain in bold, Da you should know, ki ha'adam nifal kafi pulatav. A person is affected, so to speak, by his own actions. And his heart and all of his thoughts always go after his actions that he's involved in them, whether they're good or whether they're bad. and it's beautiful words here, even if he was a completely wicked person in his heart, and all of his thoughts were bad all of his days, if he somehow he can stir himself up, his spirit, so to speak, וישים השתדלותו ויזכור בהתמדה בתורה ובמצוות, and he can sort of make an effort and get involved always in Torah mitzvot, even if he's thinking really bad things in his mind, and he, psychologically, if he could just practically do action and just carry out Torah mitzvot, even if it's not for the right intention. I'll give you an example. Someone pays you, says, I tell you what, if you keep Shabbat this week, I'll pay you £100. And you say, okay, I'll do it. Lo l'shem shemayim, I want to get £100. Even if you do that, lo l'shem shemayim, okay, miyad yenata el hatov. Immediately, the Sefer Chinuch says, immediately he will incline to the good. And the famous phrase, but even if because he's not done it, even though he's done it for his own, for not the right reason, he'll end up coming to do it for the right reason. And with the strength of his actions, the Yetzer Hara will be killed off. Because the hearts go after the action. Judaism is a religion which believes in action. It's not a religion necessarily of creed, it's more of deed. I think that's what we're sort of saying here. And deed, obviously, belief's important. The belief follows on from action. And this is what the Sefer Chinuch is telling us. And that's why we've been given lots of mitzvot here. And he goes on to explain later on, Ki yadua hadavar, you should know the thing, all our actions follow from what we do. But al-kain, and this is, people would know this from, people use this phrase after you say a Pirkei Avot, you say, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lazakhet Yisrael lefi hibra alehem Torah mitzvot. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to merit Yisrael, therefore he gave them many a Torah and lots of mitzvot. That was a blessing for us. He could have given us much less mitzvot. By giving us lots of mitzvot, we had the opportunity to do lots of good deeds, and those good deeds would end up changing our character by definition. And he goes on to, and the last line goes on to explain in the sort of the problem says that that's why kol mi sheyesh lo mezuzah bepitra, anybody who has mezuzah on his entrance, but tzitzit bebigdah, he wears tzitzit on his garment, with tefillin b'rosh and tefillin on his head. In the olden days, they wore tefillin the whole time, because these are mitzvot which are, so to speak, tamidiot. They're constant mitzvot. You've always got the mezuzah on your door. You're always wearing the tzitzit, so to speak. It's promised that he won't sin. And I thought this was just a very nice idea to explain why the Korban Pesach had so many mitzvot to do with it. The first mitzvot that basically Bnei Yisrael got was a Korban Pesach with so many mitzvot attached to it. And it was a blessing. And not just the Korban Pesach, the whole of Pesach that we think about it today. There's so many mitzvot attached to it. This was the first mitzvah Bnei Yisrael really had. And it was a blessing that we had so many mitzvot, and they would enable us to change our character. Okay, that was sort of the first half of the Shia. Now I want to look at any questions. I'm happy to take any questions. Okay, fine. Okay, so the second bit, I want to now look at various questions. What is the link between the Kiddush HaChodesh and the Korban Pesach? The first mitzvah of sanctifying the new moon, and the second mitzvah of all the mitzvahs to do with Korban Pesach. Why also, if you look at the first section, Bayit is mentioned so many times. It says in Pasuk Gimel, V'yiku lahem ish ser lebeit avot ser lebayit. Pasuk Dalet, v'shechena karav el beito, reference beito. Even towards the end in Pasuk Memvav, but bayit echad, in one house. Lo totzim min habayit, don't go out from the house. There's so many references to bayit. On the other hand, there's a big stress on nationhood. We see references to, if you look in the source in Pasuk Vav, Kol Kahal Adat Yisrael. We saw that before. I referenced that before. It says in Pasuk Mem, actually the beginning, Posuk Gimel, Dabu el Kol Adat Yisrael, speak to the whole assembly of Israel. Posuk Mem Zayin, Kol Adat Yisrael, all the assembly of Israel. Posuk Nun, V'yasu Kol B'nei Yisrael, all the people of Israel will do. So there's a on the one hand, there's a reference to buy it. On the other hand, there's a reference to Adat Yisrael, this whole assembly of Israel. And the final sort of question or link to this is, what is the ownership status of a Korban Pesach? What is it really? Is it, and there's two things, I'll go into this a bit more detail in a second. Is it a Korban Yachid? Is it an individual Korban? Or is it a Korban Sibor, a communal Korban? And if once we answer that question, we can go back and answer the other questions about the link to Kiddush HaChodesh and the reference to buy it and Kahal Adat Yisrael. So I'm going to focus on the last question first, as to why it is, as to what type of Korban this is. And now we have to sort of transform our world into the world of Korbanot. And I say that I was thinking about this, we say Echad Miyodea, we say Shisha Miyodea, who knows six? We say Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, 6 of the books of the Mishnah. Well, I think a lot of us maybe know a bit about Moed and a bit about Noshim and even a bit about Nezikin, but maybe we don't know so much. And I certainly hadn't looked at Tahavot until I've been recently doing a course on Mishnah and working myself our way through it, as Neil is as well. That there are actually 6 books of the Mishnah, and it's important to get an understanding. And this is Torah Shabbat Al Peh. As much as we should know, obviously, the Torah, Torah, we should really know the 6 books of the Mishnah. It's a fundamental part of basic Judaism. I don't call this sort of fun stuff. It's basic Judaism that we should know. And one of them is, of course, the book of Kodshim, which is about Korbanot and lots of various other things as well. And there are different ways of categorizing Korban. If you ever look at a little summary, if anyone's got the Art Scroll Chumash, at the back, it gives quite good tables about the different Korbanot, just as a hint. But there are obligatory ones which you had to bring if you sinned. There were voluntary ones you could bring if you wanted to. There's what's called Kodshei Kodshim, the most holy type of Kodshim, which would be offered up in the northern part of the Beit HaMikdash of the temple area, and you had to eat it within the confines of the temple area. Or the actual, then about Kodshim Kalim, lesser types of Korbanot, which could be offered anywhere within the courtyard of the temple. You could eat them anywhere in Jerusalem. So there are different ways. There were animal Korbans versus bird Korbans versus flower offerings. There were different types of ones, some which were completely burnt, called Olah, some which you ate lots of in, some which were eaten by the Kohanim, Shlamim, various things like that. But the real thing I want to focus on is the difference between a Korban Yachid, an individual Korban, and a Korban Sibor, a communal Korban. Okay, so let's give an example of a Korban Yachid, an individual Korban. If a person sinned, for example, they would have to bring what's called a Chatat, a sin offering. That would be an individual Korban. If they could still offer up an individual Korban as a voluntary Korban, and also on a certain specific event, like if a woman gave birth, they would have to offer an individual Korban. A Nazir, somebody who said that they weren't going to have wine and various things like that. After their Nazirut period, they'd have to offer up an individual Korban. Somebody who became impure, Tameh, would have to offer up an individual Korban. There's also a Korban Sibor, communal Korban. And this would be, typically, we say in Dav, I think we say in the Torah, it says, that the lamb was offered up, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And that was a communal offering. There was a communal in the morning and a communal offering in the afternoon. And of course, today, our tefillah, our davening replaces those communal offerings. We have shacharit in the morning and we have mincha in the afternoon, which replaces those offerings. So that was a communal. And similarly on Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, there was an additional offering called the Korban Musaf. And that was a communal offering, again, offered by the whole community. When I say it was offered by the community, it was collected, it was paid for by the half shekels. So if you remember the beginning of Adar, they would collect half shekels from everybody, or from most of the people, and those half shekels would go into a collection in the temple, and that collection would pay for the communal offerings. And it's worth noting that at this point, there's an essential difference here between an individual offering and a communal offering. They're a completely different quality, we could say. A communal offering, and this is sort of linked to the concept of tzibur, if you have davening, this is now linked to, I suppose, the common concept about davening today, that we've had to, many of us over the last year have had to daven b'yachid, have to daven individually. And now, thank God, shuls are open again, we can daven b'tzibur in a community, in a safe way. And the quality one has davening in a community cannot be compared to davening individually. Yes, you know, you can still, you've got to have the right intention, but the level, the tefillah b'tzibur is a different level. It's a different quality to tefillah by an individual. It's a bit like it's a different entity. View it as a company. A corporate structure is a different legal entity to an individual. It has limited liability. It has a different legal status. Similarly, the tzibur as a community has a different legal status to the individual. Now, with that in mind, we haven't yet decided what is the Korban Pesach. Is it an individual offering or is it a communal offering? And going back, and there's arguments both ways. And I've brought various different source sheets, which gives examples. You could argue both ways. Source number 9, this is a Mishnah in Tamura, says, and this is more describing the difference between a communal offering and an individual offering. It says, Yesh b'korbanot tzibur ma she'ein b'korbanot yachid. There are things which are communal offerings, which are not things that happen with communal offerings that don't happen with individual offerings. What are they? Shekorbanot hatzibur dochin et Shabbat. Korbanot tzibur put off Shabbat. What does that mean? It means that if the Kohen, that if the basically you would still offer up the Korban on Shabbat, even though one of the things you have to do, obviously you're offering a korban, you'd have to shech the animal, kill the animal. And that is one of the 39 malachot, the activities you can't do on Shabbat. But as it's a communal offering, you are allowed to do it on Shabbat, which is not the case with an individual offering. You weren't allowed to do it. And also it's dochet hatumah. And what that means is if the Kohen who was offering up happened to be Tomei, and all the people were Tomei at the time, they still had to bring the Korban on Shabbat. Okay. However, the Korbanot Yachid, an individual Korban, isn't Dochesh Shabbat and Tumah. So an individual can't start offering up their Korban on Shabbat. That wasn't allowed because they'd be breaking Shabbat by doing so. And if they were impure, they weren't allowed to go into the temple. Okay, so that seems to, we're not yet sure where the Korban Pesach fits in, but just bear those principles in mind. Source number 10, the Mishnah in Menachot says, and a bit I put in bold, Kol Korbanot HaYachid Unim Smicha. All individual Korbanot require leaning your force on the head of the animal, so to speak. You have to lean on the animal before you offered it. That was one of the requirements. Except for these certain types of korban, a firstborn korban, one of the Maaseh korban, and a korban Pesach. So what that is implying to say is that the korban Pesach is an individual korban because there's an exception to the rule. So this seems to be leaning to the fact that it's an individual korban. Source number 11, what does that come along and say? The Mishnah in Pesachim says, in the bit I put in bold, a Pesach Shabbat B'tumah, Ne'achal B'tumah. A Pesach, where most of the community are Tomei, and was still brought, because there was a rule that we know that if you were Tomei as an individual, you couldn't offer the Korban, the Pesach, you could have the reason for Pesach Sheni. For those people who were Tomei had a second chance to offer the Korban Pesach in Iyar, the 14th of Iyar. But if the majority of the Jewish people were Tomei, you would offer the Korban Pesach in Nissa, which is why I think one of the arguments today, whether you should perhaps offer the Korban Pesach today. There's some people every year go to the Temple Mount and try and offer up a Korban there and get arrested and things. But that's the situation, that even though people are technically, you're allowed to offer the Korban Pesach in a situation of impurity when majority were impure. And also, it doesn't say it here, you also could offer it up on Shabbat. Now we know this year Shabbat was Erev Pesach, you still would offer the Korban. So that would seem to imply, if the Korban Pesach could be offered B'tumah and on Shabbat, going back to source 9, it would seem to be more like a communal Korban, not an individual Korban. However, I didn't read the whole of source 9. There's the second half of source 9 says, Amar Rabbi Meir, Haloch Avite Kohen Gadol Par Yom Kippurim Korban Yachid. That these particular korbanot happen to be our individual, they are individual Korbans. V'dochin et Shabbat ve'et hatumah. And they actually, although they're individual Korban, they also were brought on Shabbat and were brought when you were Tameh. And therefore, he rejects the argument in the Tanakama, and he comes along and says, Ella shezamanam kabua. The rule is different. If there was a fixed time for a Korban, then you basically have to offer it, whether it's Shabbat or whether you're Tameh. It's nothing to do whether it's communal or individual. So we're knocking out the argument that Korban Pesach's really a communal Korban now. It's now pushing more to become an individual Korban. However, let's go on to source 12. Source 12 says, you can't check the Korban Pesach if you're on behalf of an individual. It has to be done as part of a group. So that seems to be, well, it doesn't sound like very individual, does it then? However, source 13 says in the Rambam, an individual who offers the Korban Pesach by himself, it is kosher. However, he has to be able to eat all of it. And he should make an effort really not to ideally eat it just as an individual. He should eat it as a community with other people. So again, we're sort of seeing, on the one hand, it's certainly not ideal to offer it as an individual. On the other hand, maybe it's got a bit of both. And again, I saw in Pesachim, in the Gemara in Pesachim, I've certainly seen one Rashi which says it's a Korban Sibur, it's a communal Korban, and apparently the other Rashi which says it's an individual Korban. If you look at source 14, it certainly seems like a communal activity. This is what happened when they bought the Korban. They said, HaPesach nishchat b'shalosh kitot. It was offered in 3 groups. Shene'amar shachtu oto kol kahal Yisrael. They shechted it, all the kahal, the Adat Yisrael. So it was certainly brought in 3 groups. You had 3 groups of each group of people. They had, say, 30 people would come along and offer it, and each person represented a whole family, and they would offer it together at the same time in the temple. So it sounds like a communal activity. So is this an individual Korban or is it a communal Korban? And there are a number of answers to this. The first answer is the Rambam in source 15, where he, in his introduction to the Mishnah of the Seder of Kodshim, he categorizes the Korbanah into 4 categories. He categorizes them as individual Korbans, communal Korbans, and then he says they're communal Korbans which are like individual ones. And his 4th category I've listed here, V'hamin ha'revi Korban Yachid Domer Korban Sibur. It's an individual Korban which is like a communal Korban. V'hu Korban Pesach, and that is the Korban Pesach. So actually, he's come up with a sort of different category. It is an individual Korban, but it's like a communal Korban. So sort of leaning a bit more to the individual, but it's like a communal Korban. So it sits somewhere between the 2. A second answer is it's actually neither. It's not an individual Korban or a communal Korban. It's a Korban of the Mishpacha, of the family. It was bought as a family, therefore it's not individual or communal in nature. And the third answer, what Rav Hutner gives in Pachad Yitzhak, he refers to it as HaPesach oseh hu et hatzibur. The Pesach is the one which makes the community. And this is sort of an idea. So in other words, the offering of the Korban Pesach generates the status of the community. So sort of before it came along, it was sort of individual. And now by offering it, you're creating the community. And with this, we're going to start to answer some of the questions I asked earlier. This is, I suppose, why there were so many mitzvot which were given at this time. This is the first opportunity for us as a community to do mitzvot. We had, yes, we've got the sanctification of the new moon, etc. But this is really the getting down to detail here. You're now going to have to do lots of mitzvah. And this is the start of making us a community by doing lots of things in one go. And I think that's very powerful. So in a sense, it's both a Korban Yachid, it's both an individual Korban and a Korban Sibur. but the consequence is the making of a nation. Now we can go back to the questions I asked earlier. Why does the Pesukim talk about, we could sort of see, I think also the link to Kiddush HaChodesh. The Kiddush HaChodesh was really making us partners, so to speak, with Rav Soloveitchik explains that we're partners in the role with God. God has asked us to be partner. We would now have control over time. We know that as servants, we never had control. We now have control over time. We have to use time in a holy way, so to speak, in a way which is going to bring sanctification and glory to God's name. And that was done through initially starting off with lots of mitzvot and doing that. We can also now see the contrast between Bayit, the house on the one hand, and all those references to Bayit, and the Kahal and the community on the other hand. And you can see this gradually happening. If you look through the verses again, that we start off, the Torah says, Ish, a man takes the lamb. Then he builds up. He takes it with his household. Then he takes it with his neighbor. And ultimately, he takes it with the community. And we can see, or we bring into the community. So you see this gradual transition, which is what Ravon is explaining, from the individual to the community. The Korban Pesach created the situation from an individual moving to a community. We see a link to this in that the Korban Pesach is one of two mitzvot where if you don't carry him out from a positive way, you get karet. You're sort of cut off from Hashem. The first Mishnah in Kritot explains the 36 mitzvot where if you don't carry them out, or most of them are negative mitzvot, you are punished. They're really bad things to do, so to speak. And 34 of them are negative. Things like breaking Shabbat, serving idols, certain forbidden relationships, eating blood, eating chametz on Pesach, really bad things. And there are two positive ones alongside those things. One of them is Korban Pesach. The other one is Brit Milah, circumcision, obviously. So those two, what's the connection here between Brit Milah, Korban Pesach? How are we going to understand this? Interestingly, we looked at the Sefer Chinuch before. The second mitzvah of the Torah is Brit Milah, the mitzvah of circumcision. We see that in Bereshit, of course. The second mitzvah in Shemot is Korban Pesach, given to the community. We also in Haggadah know, we say the two bloods, so to speak, that we had to, by the merit of two mitzvot, Bnei Yisrael were able to be, Hashem was able to take them out from Egypt. By the merit of the Brit Milah, which we carried out, because we were sort of naked, we say, of mitzvot. We had to have Brit Milah, and we had to have Korban Pesach. Those two mitzvot were the mitzvot that merited us coming out of Egypt. So what's the connection between the two? With Brit, we say it a Brit, when a baby boy has a Brit, they enter into the covenant of Avraham Avinu. It's creating Kedushat Yisrael, sanctification of Jewish people. The Korban Pesach creates Kedushat Klal Yisrael, the sanctification of the nation. In fact, there's a Rashi references the fact that there's an argument whether somebody who converts should bring a Korban Pesach as their first activity. We don't hold like that, but it is referenced within a Rashi. So we see this wonderful connection between Brit Milah, which is the individual Kedusha, which comes into us as individuals, and the Korban Pesach, which is the Kedusha of us as a community. So sort of in summary, we've now understood the Pesukim with a bit more detail. We've went through the Pesukim. We've seen why there's so many mitzvot linked to Korban Pesach. We've understood why the Sefer HaChinuch, he's explained to us beautifully why we needed all these mitzvot. That it was a blessing to us that we had lots of opportunities, and through those mitzvot, we could change our character, so to speak, even when we go in with the wrong intentions. We've delved into the world of Kodshim. We've seen what is the reason, what is a Korban Pesach? Is it an individual Korban? Is it a communal Korban? And we've seen that actually it's somewhere in between. And in the argument we said at the end there, Rav Hutner explains that it is, so to speak, the individual korban that makes the community. And we see here the power of the Sibyl, the power of the community, and we should end with a blessing that we should all come together as a community, offering up the Korban Pesach ultimately in a completely in Yerushalayim, Habniyah, B'mei will be Amen, Amen.
Good. Very good.
Any questions? Was it recorded in the end, that one?
I got from probably up after the first 5 minutes or so.
Oh, excellent. Good. Okay, because there's one or two people asked me.
I've got a slightly facetious question. What happens if you don't like lamb?
Well, it was goat. We said it could be either way.
Oh,
it was either.
Well, I only like chicken.
Yeah, well, yeah. What can you do?
I think it'll be very soon that we'll get technology that allows chicken to taste like lamb and vice versa.
Oh yes.
Yeah, you're probably right.
It should be as cheap as chicken.
I've got more of an audience here anyway, so but we can add 2 to the numbers.
Okay,
Where are they? Where are they?
Oh, they're here. You can see there's Rafi.
Let me see. Hello.
Who's that?
Oh, I
There's
can't
mums
see.
in there.
Can't see. Hi, Rafi.
Hi, Rafi. Hi.